of the word Hottentot Venus, right? Which is more of the buzzword, I think, that you are going to hear. I choose to use the name Sarah Bartman out of respect, not Hottentot Venus, because obviously that was a caricature of the real person who we know very little about. But it's important to think about the impact of her life, particularly because even today, her word, her story, narratives around her life are constantly repeated in the 21st century. And they're not necessarily really good associations. So I want to talk about that a little bit. So the presentation is called Sarah Bartman, a South African Slave, a discussion on gender and representation. This first image is a British advertisement of the Hottentot Venus exhibit. It says on the bottom, Sarki, the Hottentot Venus, now exhibiting in London, drawn from life. And so what we have here is a cartoon caricature profile of a naked black woman in some sort of perceived traditional African garb with a huge posterior, right? Smoking a pipe and holding some sort of staff. This tells us nothing about Sarah Bartman or Sarki, but it does tell us about the people who are looking at her. It tells us that people perceive this woman as some sort of monstrosity. It tells us that this is a figure that was seen as something that was not beautiful or normal or acceptable. From the 1600s, the British, in their colonizing mission, attempted to vilify the Khoi or Khoisan people based in the Cape region of South Africa, using narratives developed through travelogues and letters from sailors. There has never been a more exploited or abused people in terms of images and language. Ultimately, the Hottentot became synonymous or interchangeable with African, okay? The Hottentots, and I put this in quote, were supposed to mate with the orangutan. The males had a missing testicle, and the women had the famous Hottentot apron, which is an extended labia. Now, these were all fabrications, of course. But what it did was it allowed a language that justified the colonial hierarchy, which put the Khoisan on the bottom. And for European naturalists, the Khoisan were considered the missing link in the great chain of being. It created a language of othering, difference, savagery, and it questioned the very essence of African or Khoi humanity. As the British colonized the Cape region and there was intensified Khoisan resistance from marooned communities in the hills, the gaze moved from the male to the Khoisan female. And this is around the 18th century, creating, and this is a quote from Yvette Abrams in South Africa, creating an enduring image of the African woman before the whole world reduced to a body part, essentially her genitals. A language was created about the fabricated Hottentot apron, this extended labia, and the buttocks of these women. They were primitive, hypersexual, dirty, ugly. They exhibited depravity. They were an anomaly. They were grotesque, essentially that. And this was all exemplified or culminated in the exhibition of Sarah Bartman in Europe. What we know about Sarah Bartman? She was born around 1789 in the Eastern Cape, and she was from the Kwena people, who are a small group out of the umbrella of the Khoi or the Khoisan. Her father was a cattle drover and murdered during a Dutch raid, as was her husband, who was said to be a drummer. It was said that she had one child who died as an infant. In her early teens, she was forced to move to Cape Town for work. Though the Dutch were not allowed to enslave the Khoisan, and I put that in quotes, as non-citizens in the Cape, the Khoisan were essentially slaves, and slavery existed in the Cape from 1658 to 1838. Sarah went to work on the farm of a Dutchman. His brother, Hendrik Cesar, and his British friend, Alexander Dunlop, found her fascinating. I wonder why. And in 1810 took her, and I will say took as in robbery, as in thievery, as in stolen. She was property, she was moved. Allegedly with a contract that she would receive half the profits and be returned in 5 years if she agreed to exhibit her body in Europe. To this day, no contract has been found to prove this. And one questions how a slave negotiates a contract, right? In London, for 2 shillings, one could view Sarah performing the Hottentot Venus at number 225 Piccadilly, exhibited in a cage on a stage 2 feet high, along which she was led by her keeper and exhibited like a wild beast, being obliged to wait, stand, or sit as he ordered. She was exhibited virtually naked in skin-colored clothing. She was pinched, prodded, laughed at, sexualized, spat at, ridiculed. But the idea of exotic exhibitions were part of European, especially British culture at that point. Naturalists were in the process of having every fossil, stone, reptile, and human labeled and categorized in Europe. Medical scientists, led by Napoleon's surgeon, Georges Cuvier, codified racial difference and used Bartman's perceived abnormal sexuality, found in the study of her genitals, to establish normative European self-representation. Hobson notes, quote, Bartman became the preeminent example of racial and sexual alterity because of her ridicule and pathologized buttocks. The law case that made her famous. So, Sarah Bartman is famous not because she was exhibited, or at least we know her name, right, in terms of documentation. In fact, there were at least 3 other Hottentot Venuses after Bartman's death. She was famous because her case was brought before the British judiciary system in November 1810. And so what that means is that at that point, she enters an archive. Do you guys understand that she enters a space where daily there were observers of the court case, people documented what they saw, the public was engaged beyond just her exhibition, but she became documented, and that's how we actually are able to trace her story of her time in both London and in Paris later. The African Association for Promoting the Discovery of the Interior of Africa brought Bartman's case to court. The claim brought against Bartman's owner, Cesar, a Dutchman, was enslavement and indecency. The judge wanted to ascertain if Bartman was in agreement with her exhibition. To this day, there is no documentation of Bartman's own voice. Nowhere is she in any archive whatsoever. Though it was alleged that through a male interpreter, Bartman said she was in agreement and that she was getting money and happy. Obviously, if this woman is far away from home, right, she is at the mercy of essentially the man who owns her. And so the fact that she then is in agreement with her state or her status is highly questionable, simply because what other choice would she have at that point? Do you understand that? If she's a slave, essentially she's going to do whatever she has been primed to do, even though obviously we have to think about the small moments of agency where she possibly could have resisted in her day-to-day life. The case was dropped with a warning of indecency and a mandate that Cesar could no longer exhibit her. So what did he do? Cesar quickly sold her to an Englishman and disappeared. The rest of Sarah's story. After the case, Bartman went underground and was toured along the English countryside. She reappeared briefly in December 1811 in Manchester, where she was baptized. This is the moment where her name becomes anglicized, and so she becomes Sarah instead of Sarki. And in many cases, this is the name that in South Africa, and particularly amongst the Khoisan, they acknowledge this English version of her name, and this is the name that they apply to her and use it in documentation throughout South Africa. Okay. She was also exhibited in Bath and Limerick, Ireland. She finally resurfaced in Paris in 1814 and was then owned by an animal trainer, S. Ryu. And he was very famous. He had Sarah Bartman. He had a big black bear. That was his thing, right? And so he exhibited them together sometimes and separately. She was exhibited daily for 15 months, from 11 a.m. to 10 p.m. Also, she began to be shown in private salons. And so what would happen is very wealthy Parisians would contact SRU. They would book her to come as the surprise guest at the end. And she would be essentially paraded into these private homes. And you can imagine what else. Sarah Bartman caused a very interesting and instant fervor in Paris, which was radically different from how the British received her. So Paris took her in more as an exotic or the sexual object to be desired and obviously objectified, which was very different from how the British took her in. There was this whole sense of morality, and her exhibit being kind of the ground where people either felt that it was indecent or it was an offense to the British sense of morality to exhibit her as the Hottentot Venus, and then other people who really found her as entertaining and an example of a specimen from Africa, right? A live specimen from Africa. So in Paris, there were a number of poems, songs, caricatures, and the famous one-act vaudeville called The Hottentot Venus, or The Hatred of the French Woman. And these were all created about her. Now, this vaudeville is very interesting because it was, there were many, many theaters that put this version of this vaudeville on. And the gist of it was that French women began to get really anxious about the ways that French men began to desire, to think about, to fetishize Sarah Bartman, right, in public spaces, in these salons, in the exhibits. And so this vaudeville is about this French woman who is supposed to be married, and essentially what she does is she pads her body to look like the Hottentot Venus and blackens her face in this vaudeville as a way to say, okay, well, this is what you desire, maybe I should dress up like the thing that you desire in order for you to marry me. So there were lots of different reactions, I think, gendered reactions to Sarah Bartman in Paris. SRU was paid to make Sarah available for 3 days, in which she was examined, drawn, measured in the Jardin des Plantes in Paris by Cuvier, who was Napoleon's surgeon, and his associates. It is noted in Cuvier's writing about her that she was disliked because she refused to show or exhibit her genitals. On or about December 29th in 1815, Sarah Bartman dies. And to this day, there's no formal death certificate, which is very interesting. So the general master narrative around her death says that she died a drunk and a prostitute, right? Ultimately, she was blamed for her own demise, for her own situation. There's no proof of any of this. And so one of the things that really struck me, particularly in our contemporary times, is that how in popular discourse people are so ready to hold on and claim and reiterate, oh, she died a drunk, she died a prostitute. Well, how do we know that? We don't have any evidence of it. But in many cases, making her responsible for her own demise, making her the one who, constantly the victim. Do you understand that? In a sense where she was always the one wrong and there was no one else attached to her who could have created her situation. Sarah Bartman did not build the boat that took her from Cape Town to London. Do we understand that? Right? And so in many cases, obviously, she managed to survive being exhibited for 5 years. We know that, right? She was drawn, she was poked and prodded, she was taken through different owners. Essentially, she was bought and sold, right? We also know that she was in this court case. However, we don't know what her daily life was like. Right? We don't know what every day was like. And the fact that she managed to survive 5 years in that kind of situation tells me that, she had a sense of perseverance. Because many of us would have decided, if I even speak for myself, no, I don't necessarily know how I would have handled being put in a cage and being so far away from home. Do you guys understand that? Right? And she managed to survive that at least for 5 years.
Thank you. Yeah, well, there you have it. Now, the Sarah Bartman story is often regarded as the epitome of racist colonial exploitation and of the commodification and dehumanization of African people. And this is where really I come in and I say, well, look, that vaudeville that you spoke about, where the French women started wanting to be like her because for the reasons that they put out. In essence, however, no one knows exactly what Sarah looked like, and her possible representation as a stunningly beautiful woman who was left at the mercy of her tormentors, and even regarded as a missing link between humans and apes. In my mind, I thought there had to be a correction to this, and I'm punching holes in conventional history because there might be things that are not seen to us, because look at it this way. If Sarah Bartman had a pig behind, she was not the only one. Why was she the only one taken to Europe? Why not the others? And if she was going to be sold around and in circuses and to make money, why not